Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Dan Hamilton. I'm the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, where I direct the Global Europe program. We're really delighted today to have a book presentation, new book by two colleagues, and I'll introduce them in a second. The Wilson Center procedures are for questions and comment is if you can send those via Twitter at Wilson Center GEP Global Europe Program. So Twitter at Wilson Center GEP, or also via email at gep@wilsoncenter.org. If you have questions, comment, send those in those two channels, and we'll make sure to include them in the discussion when we get to that. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you to our two authors. We're talking today about a book about so-called partners of first resort, the United States and the European Union. Joe Biden has said himself that Europe, quote, remains America's indispensable partner of first resort, and quote, the cornerstone of our engagement with the world. So we want to unpack the meaning of that statement, what it might mean for the Biden administration, and also for US-EU relations. And our two authors have had a very extensive practical experience with that relationship. David McKean is a fellow right now at the German Marshall Fund. He was the former director of policy planning at the State Department, former US ambassador to Luxembourg. He has another book I want to plug for you coming out in November, so get ready. It's called Watching Darkness Fall, The Rise of Franklin Roosevelt, His Ambassadors, and the Rise of Adolf Hitler. And I'm waiting to read that one. That sounds great, David. And he's joined by his colleague, Bart Szewczyk, who's an adjunct professor at Sciences Po and Paris. Bart, though, is interesting because he has had government experience both with the European Commission and its kind of policy planning think tank, and also as a member of the policy planning staff of the US Department of State. That's a rare feat. I did something like that with the German Foreign Ministry in the State Department, so we compare notes about what that is. It's a great unusual opportunity to see how things work on both sides of the Atlantic. So I'm going to turn to David and Bart to introduce the book and their theses, and I think they're going to have a little discussion among themselves, and then we'll get to our discussion with the larger group here today. So please turn, I think, first to David. Is that right?
Right.
Yes, please go ahead.
Thanks, Dan. Very much appreciate it, and delighted to be here today, albeit virtually, and still somewhat in shock from yesterday, but we'll, I hope, have a terrific discussion today. Our fundamental argument in our book is that the transatlantic relationship is critical to the restoration and strengthening of the global order, to the rules-based order, whatever you want to call it, which we contend has been fraying for years, and which we also contend was really shattered during the last 4 years of the Trump administration. David Ignatius wrote a column in the Washington Post, I think it was in November, and he quoted Henry Kissinger as to what it would take to actually strengthen the global order, to strengthen the liberal international order. And he noted two very, very important concepts. One was that there needed to be a common purpose on big issues, even when there are rivalries. And two, that there needed to be mutual security for all powers. And I think probably I would add now a third one in light of yesterday, which is that in the United States, we need a strong, functioning democracy with moral leadership and respect for our democratic institutions. But keep these concepts in mind, because we'll return to them during our discussion. But first, I want to just, if I can, give you a little bit of an idea of how Bart and I organized our book. And really, the first half of the book is a history of the transatlantic relationship, and we go through it fairly briskly. But I think it's useful. Some of it's well-trodden territory, but you know, I think our feeling is that in order to know, to have a sense of where we go in the future, we've got to have a pretty good idea of where we've been in the past and where we are today. And I don't want to overdraw the comparisons, but particularly given my other book, I think there are some interesting parallels between the United States today and in the 1930s. There was, of course, in the 1930s, a global economic depression. And while in the United States, the stock market's up and a number of people are doing very well, there's also a large percentage of this country that is facing serious economic challenges. There are millions of people who are facing food security issues. And so there are some similarities. It's also the 1930s, at the beginning of the decade, there was an ineffectual president who blamed really the depression in the United States on foreign powers. The mood of the country at that time was very isolationist, and I believe it's very isolationist again. There was a strong America First movement. Many people think that Donald Trump invented America First. It's been around for decades. And there was also a struggle between authoritarianism, cloaked in fascism at the time, and democracy. And I think we are also seeing that. One of the events that we discuss in the book is the meeting between Prime Minister Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt off the coast of Newfoundland in August 1941. And this was a secret meeting. At the time, Britain was in dire straits. London was being bombed. They were losing ships in the Atlantic. They needed US military assistance. And Franklin Roosevelt wanted to give that military assistance, although it was not popular in the United States. But there was something else that Franklin Roosevelt understood at the time. He was looking beyond the war, and he was looking to the post-war world. And he really believed that it was important to set out a vision for that period. And so, because he believed that the Treaty of Versailles had failed, that the League of Nations had failed, and that World War II was really the culmination of this. And so he and Churchill laid out a vision, a set of principles. And among those principles were the disarmament of aggressor nations, obviously Germany and Italy at the time, self-determination for people around the world. And this was a major, actually, concession by Prime Minister Churchill at the time, because obviously England was still, United Kingdom was still a major empire, even though it was nearly bankrupt and had been severely weakened. Another important principle was respect for the sovereignty of nations. And finally, consistent with Roosevelt's policies in the United States, and particularly a speech he'd given called the Four Freedoms, he laid out in the Atlantic Charter a strong humanitarian component, which was really based on those four freedoms: respect for freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from fear, and what he called freedom from want. Really, that everybody deserved to have a job and to have economic security. So what's so important, I think, about the Atlantic Charter is that it really becomes the foundation for a number of the post-war institutions that we know today. And I'm referring, of course, to the UN, which was founded in 1945, NATO in 1949. Excuse me, really the foundation for mutual security that Kissinger talked about. Treaty of Rome in 1957, which led to the founding of the European Union. And so what Bart and I have tried to do in our book is we call for a restatement of the Atlantic Charter. And I wish we were the first to do it. We're not. This is something that President H.W. Bush called for before he left office. It's something that Henry Kissinger has also called for. But we believe, again, it's very, very important to have that vision laid out. What is it that we want for the world? And one of the things we learned in policy planning is that in order to fulfill a vision, you've got to understand what are the challenges and impediments. You've also got to ask what are the alternatives, and then you've got to craft a strategy. And so before we discuss those challenges and we talk a little bit about our strategy, I'll ask Bart just to pick up where I left off in terms of the history and gallop through the Cold War and the Obama years, and maybe take us right up to the present.
Sounds great. Thanks very much, David, and thank you, Dan, and the Wilson Center for hosting us today. It's the Wilson Center is really privileged to have Dan as one of its fellows, just because of his sheer enormous experience on both sides of the Atlantic, as he mentioned, and also his ongoing engagement in specific projects, reports, and ongoing internal decisions, both in the United States and in Europe, on all these issues that we're discussing today. And so there's really no one better served than having Dan within your team. Now, let me go quickly through the Cold War part of the book. And the reason for our sort of long frame of the historical analysis is just to take a longer term perspective on of the underlying issues and draw some of the lessons from history and apply them, as you'll see, to our present day questions. So, as you look at the Cold War, the transatlantic relationship quickly settled into a relatively stable equilibrium, with the US in the predominant role as security guarantor, even as there were ups and downs in the relationship, such as the Suez Crisis of 1956 or Charles de Gaulle's withdrawal from NATO's military structures in 1966. And these were serious issues, but they never cut against the sort of existence of the transatlantic relationship. And it's interesting that while European partners committed troops alongside the United States during the Korean War, there were no European countries that supported US efforts during the Vietnam War. So, there were ups and downs in the relationship with perhaps an overall stable equilibrium. But while people sometimes mythologize the simplicity in transatlantic unity during the Cold War, the real golden age of the West and the liberal order, in our view, occurred during the 1990s, when you had NATO and EU enlargement, the notion that all major powers, including Russia and China, would become liberal democracies, and the entrenchment of the overall Western standard for global success across international institutions and international thinking. And this global standard was based around democracy, human rights, rule of law, free trade, and market capitalism. Now, if you fast forward to the 2000s, 9/11 and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq obviously dominated US foreign policy concerns, but they actually did not change fundamentally the strategic trajectory of the liberal model. And then came the financial crisis of 2008 and the Russia-Georgia war, which significantly undercut this overall strategic narrative. So in essence, in our view, the modern story of the West is a struggle between the hopes of 1989, a year that ended the Cold War and that celebrated the success and enlargement of the liberal order, and the fears of 2008, a year remembered for its internal challenges and external threats from liberal actors. And now the main question for the current moment in time is whether leaders can live up to their best aspirations or will succumb to panic and doubt that characterize 2008 and perhaps the past 4 years. In some ways, the West had become a victim of its own success. Its model of democracy, human rights, rule of law, market economy, and free trade had widespread appeal around the world. And thus the first post-Cold War generation during the 1990s and 2000s transformed the somewhat narrower strategic concept of the West into the broader liberal international order, or the more neutral sounding rules-based global order. But in some ways, the West overextended its ambitions. Nowadays, no one really expects Russia or China to become liberal democracies in the near or medium term. And in some ways, the West gave insufficient priority to its core engine, which is the transatlantic alliance. It's interesting that there was a conference on Westlessness at the Munich Security Conference earlier last year in February. And in the context of overall debates over weaknesses within the West and so forth, the Indian Foreign Minister Jaishankar pointed out that when the West does not get its act together, you could forget about things like multilateralism or global action, because you really need a core driving set of countries to lead overall global efforts. And this is basically at the heart of our argument. Now, moving from the 2000s to the Obama-Biden years, in many ways, President Obama sought to build a more equitable partnership with Europe, with numerous transatlantic summits and meetings in his first 3 years. But the real diplomatic action and concrete achievements seemed to occur elsewhere. You had the reset with Russia, pivot to Asia, and an overall new engagement with the world through the G20 and other formats. And those other engagements seem to deliver concrete results in a way where lots of meetings with the European counterparts just delivered more meetings with the European counterparts. And in fact, the most tangible form of transatlantic cooperation in the initial years of the Obama-Biden administration, which was NATO's intervention in Libya in 2011, proved to be a short-lived success, but a long-term cautionary lesson. Now, during President Obama's second term, the Syrian civil war further created the perception of transatlantic divisions. And only by 2014, when you had Russia's aggression in Ukraine, ISIL's terrorist attacks throughout Europe, and massive irregular migration due to the Syrian conflict, did all these crises crystallize the need for transatlantic cooperation and sort of a newfound focus on Europe. And at the end, notwithstanding President Obama's personal popularity among Europeans, and you can track it back to the 2008 campaign rally in Berlin, when you had hundreds of thousands of Europeans show up to see then candidate Obama, to ongoing days whenever President Obama travels throughout Europe. He's immensely popular both at the leaders level and at the popular citizen level. And in many ways, transatlantic achievements were increasingly difficult to distinguish from global achievements, whether nuclear nonproliferation or climate change. And in fact, President Obama's Nobel Peace Prize was not followed by the Charlemagne Prize, which is a prize in the service of European integration. Interestingly, the last American to receive that award was Bill Clinton. And the only distinctly transatlantic project, which was the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, was not successful, even though its sort of Asian counterpart, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, was at least signed by the respective leaders. And finally, NATO's enlargement to Montenegro did not really compare in significance to the expansions of the 1990s or 2000s. And so as the transatlantic partnership became more equitable, it also made it more possible that the two sides would drift apart. And so in the end, for all their personal affinity for President Obama, Europeans nowadays are more likely to recall the reset with Russia, the red line in Syria, and strikingly, going back to the Munich Security Conference I mentioned early last year, President Macron, I linked the red line in Syria to then Russia's aggression against Ukraine, 7 years later, drawing a link between those two issues, or the pivot to Asia. These were the main policies from the US that Europeans are more likely to remember from the Obama administration rather than any of the global successes. And then, of course, we turn to the past 4 years, which made things even more difficult in the transatlantic partnership. And I'll turn it back to David.
Well, I won't spend a lot of time on the Trump years, but I do think, again, it's worth sort of reminding people that this is a president who came to office with absolutely no international experience other than ownership of golf courses in Scotland. And I do think it's also worth remembering his inaugural speech from 4 years ago, when he talked about the United States undergoing a period of carnage, American carnage. It's actually what we saw yesterday. But in terms of that phrase, it actually had real implications for international relations and for the transatlantic relationship, I believe, because he was also incorporating in that his policy of America first. And that's really a zero-sum game, that unless you're winning, you're losing. And that was Trump's view all along. He was, as everyone knows, very insulting to his European counterparts consistently. But Bart and I interviewed a number of different experts and policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think the most positive thing we heard about Trump's foreign policy was that he didn't really have one. And that in the end, most European leaders came to ignore him, and that in the end, he actually had little impact. Nevertheless, I might also add, I think that most folks consider that the Trump years will be considered an aberration in our international relations, that it doesn't have staying power. But I do think he did enormous damage to our standing in the world. I don't think there's a question about that. And again, yesterday was just further proof of that and compounded it. The question, of course, is what can President Biden do to repair the damage? And in the beginning of this talk, I mentioned that there were a number of challenges and impediments confronting the incoming Biden-Harris administration. In terms of the impediments, I mean, internally, domestically, we have we still have a very, very divided nation. 74 million people voted for Donald Trump. We have been economically weakened by the COVID crisis. And I don't know that our politics are likely to improve significantly anytime soon. In terms of sort of just very direct foreign policy, few people don't understand the value of alliances, and that's a problem. Most people think we spend too much money on foreign aid. If you ask the average person, they'll tell you you get wild numbers: 10%, 15%, 20% of our national budget is spent on foreign aid, and of course, as we all know, it's far less than 1%. We also have cultural issues that will plague us for the foreseeable future, whether it's racial strife, gun violence. There are a lot of problems that this country is facing. Externally, we also have significant challenges. Bart mentioned Russia, and Russia continues to be a thorn in the side of the Europeans and the United States. It may be a declining power, and economically it certainly is, but it has the capacity to project power beyond its own borders and to create mischief. And it will continue to do so both in Europe and elsewhere. And we've also briefly talked about China. And China is it's a rising power. It's ruled by an authoritarian, but it's ruled by a man who has a vision. He has a strategy, and he has increasing economic and military leverage. And I'm sure we'll talk about that in the question and answer period. So the Biden administration has its work cut out for it. And I might ask Bart just to talk for a minute about some of the creating a closer relationship with our European allies.
Great. And then we can turn back to Dan and Q&A. So look, we think that in Europe, the Biden-Harris team will find real partners, but with conflicting trends. On the one hand, you have greater ambition, but fewer resources, particularly in the aftermath of the COVID crisis. You have visions of autonomy combined with the reality of interdependence. You have Europe in search of strategy, but with disjointed tactics. And overall, with good intentions, but discordant outcomes. Now, with perhaps the most transatlantic US administration in decades in the Biden-Harris team, both sides, both Europe and America, will need to seize this unique strategic opportunity to make the promise of partnership a reality. And notably, just last month, at the beginning of the month, the EU came out with a relatively comprehensive set of policy proposals to seize this, what it called a once-in-a-generation opportunity. And we really think that this is a really unique moment. And underlying our overall analysis is the fundamental strategic logic that for the United States, the road to success in foreign policy, whether confronting Beijing, Moscow, COVID, or ISIS, leads through synergy with Europe and vice versa. And, you know, to build on prior achievements rather than simply repeating past practices, we think that Western leaders can reinvigorate the alliance through innovative efforts, culminating with what David pointed out at the beginning of the talk, is a restatement of the Atlantic Charter, what we call a new Transatlantic Strategic Partnership Agreement, and the creation of a Transatlantic Council. Now, let me spend a little bit of time on both just to set out what we're arguing for. In our view, a new Atlantic Charter, new TSPA, could set out key areas of foreign policy and economic coordination and establish a new institutional structure such as the Transatlantic Council to facilitate cooperation at head of state, ministerial, and staff levels. Now, this would be a flexible arrangement akin to the G7 or G20. So, you know, no permanent secretariats or buildings or anything of that sort. It's just a different way of configuring and organizing ourselves. And transatlantic summits could be layered on top of existing NATO summits, where the first day would focus on NATO's core mission of collective defense. And then you would have a second day of a wider discussion of foreign policy challenges with the presence of all NATO and all EU member states, along with the NATO Secretary General, European Commission President, and European Council President. We can get into in the Q&A into specific alternative arrangements and, you know, why we think our proposal is better, but this is essentially what we argue for. Now, it's important to note that none of this type of cooperation is on autopilot, and a lot of work will be necessary to build back better after the past 4 years. And ultimately, you know, as a fallback option, we think that even more important than negotiating a new text or establishing novel structures will be the psychological impact of restoring the old ethos that characterized the West. You know, the instinctive muscle memory of relying on each other as the partner of first resort, even if not only resort, has really atrophied within the transatlantic community, and for the sake of the United States and Europe, as well as the wider liberal order, a new strategic culture should emerge. As Dan pointed out at the beginning of the talk, you know, we got the phrase partners of first resort from President-elect Biden's speech at the Munich Security Conference now 8 years ago in 2013, when he was vice president, when he, you know, stressed the importance of the transatlantic partnership. But it's not a throwback to 8 years ago. It's a phrase that we think has underlying strategic vision, and it's become resonant at the EU level as well. And notably, just in the aftermath of the November elections in the US, the EU's HRVP, the equivalent sort of a Minister of Foreign Affairs, Josep Borrell, in his address to the European Parliament, stated, and I quote, "The EU and the US are and will remain key partners of first resort in critically difficult moments." And he also went on to say, you know, for the EU, the US is the most important ally, and he thinks that the same is true in reverse. But, you know, this is not the only view in Europe or in the United States, and there are competing visions and competing priorities. And interestingly, there was, you know, some difference of views between, let's say, French President Emmanuel Macron on this issue and the German Defense Minister Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer. Some of this might be a matter of emphasis and nuance, but in any event, I think you know, these questions are out there for the two sides to hash out and to determine jointly. Now, it's important to note, and we'll close here, that first resort does not mean only resort. And other partners such as Australia, India, Japan, South Korea, and others will be also integral for global collective action. But what we have in mind here is that we need to repair the transatlantic partnership as the core engine for the wider machinery of the liberal order. And for European audiences, it's akin to Franco-German leadership within the European Union. If France and Germany, get their act together and reach agreement on a particular policy area, it's more likely than not that that will be adopted at the EU level. And if you can't get agreement between France and Germany, it's also likely that nothing will get done at the EU level. So essentially, this is our strategic vision on how to reinvigorate and reimagine the transatlantic partnership for the challenges of our time. And now we can turn it over back to Dan and to your questions.
Thank you both so much for doing this, and I hope people will pick up a copy of the book and read it themselves. We're getting some questions, so let me weave those questions into sort of my own kind of couple comments. I think there's a question that when you say a new charter of some kind, I mean, who's signing this charter? Who are you working it out with? Is it just a collection of countries? Is it the EU? Is it, I know, NATO and the EU? You mentioned NATO and the EU meetings, but I mean, who's doing it really? And if I could add my own just personal point, I think something like that would be important if it's not just a statement, but it's anchored to something that really breaks some new ground. The idea I have been floating for many years is the idea of a transatlantic solidarity pledge, that the US and the European Union say we will not remain passive in the event of some disruption, natural man-made, to critical functions of our societies. It's equivalent to what the EU has as a solidarity clause. We have nothing binding the US and the EU. That's always made this partnership sort of difficult. We have a NATO, treaty, North Atlantic Treaty, Article 5, but we have nothing equivalent with the EU. You don't want to duplicate or displace the NATO commitment, but it seems to me it needs something more than just good words. And as the question said, and who is this with? So that's one question I'll just leave with you. The others that are coming in are really about the administration entering, the relationship one president at a time, but on day one, there are issues that just exist. And some of them are problems across the Atlantic, not because of one president or the other, but because there's, one could argue a pretty bipartisan consensus on a few policies that create some issues with the Europeans. One is burden sharing. You could argue that, I think, that there is deep agreement among Republicans and Democrats that when you say equitable partnership, it means the Europeans have to step up. It's hard to explain, I think, to 330 million Americans why they're still carrying more of the burden of defense and security for 500 million Europeans. And for all of the drama of the Trump presidency, his supporters would say, that's one thing he really did kind of work on. So that's a legacy issue. That's not about Biden or Trump. It's a deeper question. The second is on China. One could argue, well, Trump was really, very tough on China. There is a deeper resonance in the American body politic that the U.S. in fact does need to be tougher on China, and whether the Europeans will go along with sort of this approach is a question. The third is legislation that exists that will compel the administration to follow the law, and that's on sanctions. There are existing U.S. sanctions legislation just recently passed again through the National Defense Authorization Act that will compel any administration to follow the law. And that could include sanctions on European companies, so for instance, for Nord Stream 2 or other issues. So this is it's a basket of issues at the doorstep of a new administration. So how do we practically, address those if we want to achieve a more ambitious partnership? I'll leave. however you'd like to take those questions on.
Great. David, do you want to start, or do you want me to offer a few thoughts? I'll start with a couple of comments on these very important questions. Look, in terms of who would sign the TSPA, we have a big tent approach. So all NATO and all EU leaders, including NATO SG, European Commission President, and European Council President. Now, we would acknowledge at the outset the downside of having a large group, in that, you know, you tend to kind of dilute the message and coordinating is more difficult. But we think it's important because we need everyone sort of rowing in the same direction. And without that underlying process of getting everyone's buy-in, you know, it's quite possible that you get, let's say, an agreement between the US president and the European Commission and Council presidents, but then, you know, you have a format of 17+1 with China by countries that don't feel bound by those commitments because they weren't at the table. They weren't discussing those commitments with the US president. And, you know, and so everyone's sort of doing their own thing within an overall sort of amorphous consensus. And it's striking that China has recognized the importance of a big tent approach, because its proposed summit with the EU for late last year, which ended up being postponed because of the COVID crisis, was in fact not only with the EU leaders, von der Leyen and Michel, as well as with the host, German Chancellor Merkel, but it was envisioned to have all EU member states participating. And it's important to note here that we're not trying to replicate any or duplicate any existing structures, but we want to have them work better together. And, you know, essentially, NATO is a great transatlantic format, but its agenda is too limited. Even though it can address issues like China or trade or climate, it's at its best a collective defense, a military alliance organization. And we want to maintain the sort of the effectiveness of that structure. The EU-US format, again, it has a broader agenda, but its membership is too limited, because if you talk about EU-US summits, you're really talking about the US president alongside with the European Commission president and the European Council president. And we think that that's not enough. And the reason why this would be, you know, going beyond mere rhetoric or mere declarations is that we envision joint dialogues on issues like China or trade or digital data flows or, you know, cybersecurity or other issues that the two sides have in common, and that really currently either get addressed but insufficiently, or, you know, at the leaders level in only perfunctory manner. And we want to have a more structured, standardized approach to this. I'll leave, maybe, I have a few thoughts on burden sharing in China, but let me kick it back to David for his perspective as well.
Thanks, Bart. Yeah, on burden sharing, look, I think, again, Donald Trump didn't invent burden sharing. That was something that was talked about a great deal during the Obama administration as well. And I know, as ambassador to a very, very small country, but a very rich country, it was something that I was trying to impress on my counterparts with some frequency. And the trajectory has been in the right direction. There's a long way to go. But I also think, you know, burden sharing is something we need to think about a little bit more, perhaps a little bit more broadly than we have in the past. And I know that this is something that that Europeans are anxious to engage on. You know, there are so many issues when you talk about defense now, when you talk about the mutual defense of the United States and Europe. Cyber is now a huge issue. and sort of what resources is Europe devoting to cyber? Should that be considered part of burden sharing? You know, actually, foreign assistance is in many ways a preventative conflict measure, because if you are hopefully helping people to achieve some measure of economic security and perhaps to have a job, the idea that they're going to be less interested in perhaps using some sort of force to achieve their ends is real. So I think that we need to think about it a lot more broadly. It's clearly an important issue. And you're right, Dan, but you know, it's what about in terms of explaining it to the American public, but it's what I said about foreign policy in general, explaining to the American public. It's a very, very tough thing to do. This is something that, you know, Jake Sullivan is going to try to do as National Security Advisor, actually. He's going to try to, I think, because of his broad experience as both an advisor on domestic policy and foreign policy, to help people understand a little bit why it's so important to have a strong foreign policy and why it's ultimately in their interests.
Yeah, I would just add very briefly on burden sharing that, you know, Trump made the issue a lot more bombastic and a lot more vocal, but he didn't actually do all that much about it. And if you take a look at the increased defense spending in Europe over the past 4 years, they largely tracked trends begun in the Obama administration in 2014 at Wales in the aftermath of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And so, you know, it's not like just because you're louder and about an issue that you're going to be more successful in addressing it. And I think the Biden hires team is going to probably return to a more diplomatic, quiet approach to this, but no less effective because, again, the increases started under the Obama-Biden administration when you know, it was recognized that they were needed. Obviously, COVID makes this whole issue a lot more difficult. And the other perspective I would add, sort of piggybacking off what David said, is that, you know, burden sharing doesn't only encompass defense, but if you look at development aid, Europeans spend a lot more on foreign aid than the US does, which was actually not the case at the inception of these programs in the 1960s, when, you know, basically the US and Europeans had an equal burden sharing in this regard. And if you think about, you know, welcoming refugees, again, Europe, by virtue of its geography, more than, let's say, a political decision, has welcomed a lot more refugees than over the past 6 years, 7 years than the US has. And so, you know, it's a complicated debate that I think will return to a more sensible discussion and path forward. And I'm sure will be on the radar screen for the new team. On China, you know, it's a fascinating topic because just last month you had at the same time two events. At the beginning of the month, you had this set of policy proposals that the EU adopted to offer to the new Biden-Harris team in what it called, again, a once-in-a-generation opportunity. And in the same month, 4 months later, you had the announcement of the EU-China deal as an agreement in principle, which was primarily economically driven to promote European investment in China, you know, selling cars and basic materials and financial services and so forth. And in some ways, there's a strategic tension between those two decisions, those two choices. And I think what a setup like the Transatlantic Council, and maybe, you know, even forgetting about new documents or institutions, just a return to transatlantic consultation and figuring out what each other is thinking is a better way of approaching these very complicated decisions, because otherwise you get, you know, all sorts of declarations that turned out to be somewhat inconsistent, and then just add a little bit of confusion to an overall difficult strategic environment.
Yeah, and
can I just ask you on the sanctions, and also I didn't add one more on tariffs. So President Trump had levied, you know, Section 232 tariffs on our own allies for national security reasons. And the incoming team has said basically, you know, we want to consult on these, but we're not going to lift them anytime soon. So again, we are sanctioning our own allies on grounds of national security for steel and aluminum. There's a whole digital taxation issue looming in which we could do more tariffs. So how do you think the administration can address these issues that clearly these irritants are going to, it would seem, prevent, you know, a more expansive partnership from emerging?
Well, let me just make one comment on China before I turn to that. But, you know, I think the other thing that we have to recognize is that notwithstanding some of the recent developments between the Chinese and Europe in terms of the investment pact, which has yet to be finalized and will have to go through a lot of different steps. The United States and Europe remain each other's largest trading partners, and that's an enormously significant thing to remember. And the largest foreign direct investment in the United States is Europe collectively. So the economic relationship is very, very deep between the United States and Europe, and very, very important. And together with you know, with the Japanese and Australia, it's more than 60% of global GDP. In terms of the sanctions, you know, you raise a very interesting point, Dan, but I do think that this is something that will be negotiated. And yes, it's an irritant, but, you know, under Trump, these irritants tend to either be ignored or to exacerbate. And the only way to clear an irritant away is to discuss it, is to talk it through. And so my sense is that the United States and our counterparts in Europe will engage immediately, and we'll do this respectfully, and we'll see what happens. But we have a much better opportunity here to make progress.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, you know, my sense is that the new Biden-Harris team wants to approach all these difficult and complicated issues in a thoughtful, processed, structural manner, where, you know, not everything that just because something was adopted under the Trump administration is immediately reversed on day one, and vice versa. Not everything that the Trump administration did not pursue is immediately pursued. There's some things that are clear decisions that the team has made already, which is to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement, to you know, have a more sensible approach on the Iran nuclear deal. But, you know, they're going to approach these decisions in a genuine, structured manner. And ultimately, my sense is that the instincts are one of consultation and cooperation, and that this issue, along with many others, will be resolved amicably. But I think that there's just so many difficult problems to deal with that they're trying to make sure that they're doing this thoughtfully and not rushing things through just because they were done under the Trump administration.
It seems to me, you know, over the time, we've kind of lost the narrative about why the transatlantic relationship is still this cornerstone, as you mentioned, first resort relationship. The pivot implies there's an either-or quality to U.S. priorities. I always have to explain to our European friends, we don't really have the luxury of choice. We are Atlantic and Pacific. It's not, a switch. You just have to pay attention to what's going on. And but it's a hard message to get across. I mean, some of your ideas, I think, might lift that narrative, and I think that's quite important. You know, and I'm always confounded on the economic relationship, why more people don't just look at some of the facts, as David said. You know, my analogy is the EU-China commercial relationship is a sort of a two-lane highway. It's a goods highway. it's very crowded, and it's busy and boisterous, but it's just basically a goods highway. They're trying to build the third lane in that highway of an investment agreement, but it's still, a work in progress. It's, it's a construction site. And so you got a construction site on a 2-lane highway, it's, stopped up. But the transatlantic economic relationship is a 6-lane Autobahn. I mean, it's got the goods highway, it's got services, it's got investment, it's got jobs. I mean, jobs, 15 million jobs, in fact. And we are each other's biggest source of onshore jobs. Plus, you have the innovation economies that seems to me is going to be much more of a focus for the Biden administration of how you harness the power and of the innovation economies in democracies. And if you chill that 6-lane Autobahn, you're in real trouble. And that's sort of at the moment sort of where we are because of the pandemic. So I think we need a new narrative. I'm hopeful that you're offering some of that. It just strikes me where we're starting out, regardless of our instinct, which I think is what Bart said. This administration, just think of yesterday's events. This administration is going to have some pretty serious domestic priorities. The pandemic relief, vaccine distribution, dealing with the polarization of the country that David has talked about, the whole social reckoning that has, I think, in fact, catapulted the Democrats to majorities in the Senate, the legacy of the Trump period. This is a huge domestic agenda. It seems to me the United States is not going to be able to help others unless it can show it can help itself right now. And I wonder if that's going to crowd out, regardless of positive instincts, just crowd out attention and time and energy to something more ambitious, whether we have to sort of reposition first before we can take on something. I wonder about your time frame here when you talk about these things, given all those other issues.
No, it's a good question. Look, I think Jake Sullivan said it very well in several interviews over the past few weeks, that domestic policy is foreign policy and foreign policy is domestic policy. And so there are so many issues nowadays that are intertwined that, really thinking about these things separately is not always effective. And so if you take a look at the COVID crisis, it originated in China and spread across Europe and into the United States. And now it's a domestic issue for many countries, including the United States, as they're trying to grapple with the public health crisis as well as the economic aftermath. And you can, apply the same logic to a lot of other issues. The other point I would make is that this is going to be a very energetic team that will be able to walk and chew gum at the same time and address a lot of the domestic priorities at the same time that they address a lot of these foreign policy issues. And, the virtue of having been out of office for 4 years is that it's given ample time to reflect and to think about the underlying issues and to, go through some of the analyses and make the underlying decisions to then implement once you come into office. And you see that the transition team has been very effective in terms of nominating its cabinet candidates and the rest of the White House and U.S. staff. And so I think they'll be able to hit the ground running on day one. And, in terms of our timeline, obviously there'll be, it'll be a matter of decision for the new team. There will be a NATO summit at some point, probably this year, I would imagine, at which you could, gesture to some of these larger initiatives. The team has spoken about organizing an Alliance of Democracies Summit or Summit of Democracies, which could be the venue to, think about the transatlantic core engine. And, beyond that, you'll have, as you pointed out, Dan, pressing issues such as, let's say, the EU-China deal, where our existing structures are just, they've turned out to be insufficient to yield good outcomes. And on the EU side, for instance, they've yielded discordant outcomes where, on the one hand, you have a once in a generation opportunity or offered for the United States. On the other hand, at the end of the month, you have this outreach to China. And so I think we need to be a little bit more thoughtful about how we reach some of these decisions and how we go through the underlying analysis.
Just a couple of quick comments, Dan. I think in terms of domestic challenges crowding out foreign policy, I mean, I think let's remember that President Biden, when he was in the Senate, was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee for many, many years. As a vice president, he was very active internationally. His first announcements were his national security team. He's somebody that understands that the future of the United States and the economic strength of the United States depends on its standing on the world in large part. We are an integrated global society. And the other thing I would just mention quickly is, something that you've been working on, I know, with the Dutch Foreign Ministry. You've talked about it in terms of a number of areas where there are commonalities and such as the healthcare sector, the tech sector, climate. These are not sort of most necessarily conventional foreign policy issues, but they're issues where the United States and Europe have a lot of common interests. And that's actually something we propose in our book, is that in a number of these areas, we need to be engaging the Europeans about the future. What are they doing about artificial intelligence, which that actually it's both a foreign policy and obviously a domestic issue. And Putin has said whoever controls artificial intelligence will control the world. So it's a pretty important issue. And what are the Europeans doing about it? Where does it stand in the United States? And these are things that we need to engage. So in many ways, I really like the way you described it as a whole of government approach with our European allies, and I think that's something that we need to engage in, and I believe the Biden administration will.
I would just briefly,
if I could, we're coming to the end. We have about 3 minutes. I have two questions that just came in from our global fellow, Diana Negroponte. I want to give her that time for those questions, but just probably a minute on each if you can. She asked about environmental cooperation, how it fits into your vision here of this charter and a new framework. And the other is on non-proliferation. The Obama administration made that a big, priority globally. It didn't seem to, get as far as they had hoped. Is there a better way to do something transatlantically? So, with apologies that we probably can only do 1 minute on all that.
Sure, I'll be very quick on climate. Listen, this is clearly, again, a huge priority for the Biden administration. My old boss, John Kerry, former Secretary of State, is the special envoy for climate. It's something that he cares deeply about, knows a great deal about. He's going to have an adequate staff. He's laser focused on this issue. And we are in agreement with a lot of our European allies on this. And it's an area where there can be collaboration with the Chinese. And we have to push the envelope on this. It's an issue that has grown in importance during the Trump administration because of their lack of focus. And I believe it's something that will be, alongside of these other issues, a major priority for the Biden administration.
Yeah, I would just close that on non-proliferation. Likewise, this will be a very important issue for the new team. And I think there'll be just a new ethos of coordinating with other international partners to accomplish these overall global objectives. And just to close briefly, the cover of our book has a picture of a big blue sky in the middle of it. And it's supposed to evoke the blue sky memo format in US government circles, which is to think big, but realistically to, be ambitious, but set out some practical steps to achieve what you're proposing. And, the skies may have dimmed a little bit, especially since yesterday, but they'll get brighter again. And I hope that people will return to, sort of a long-term visionary outlook for what we can do together between the United States and Europe.
Thank you. Partners of First Resort, David McKean, Bart Szewczyk, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to staying in touch and I hope everyone goes out and reads the book. Thanks
Thanks very
again.
much.
Talk
Thank
to
you.
everyone soon.
Happy New Year.
Take care.
Bye.